Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor. And it's the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again. And once again, I'll be talking about Conan. Last month was Sumerian September, and I read all of the Conan stories that were written by Robert E. Howard. Of course, I had read these stories before a few times, but it had been a long time, so I read them all last month. I read them in the 3-volume Del Rey set, which I think is the best way to read these stories. It's just a beautiful set of books with a lot of care taken in the production of the books and the texts used in the books. Just a wonderful series. And the stories are presented in the order that Robert E. Howard wrote the stories, which is important because you can see the character develop over time and you can see how his writing developed a bit. And by this point, this is the third and last volume from Del Rey for Conan. This is The Conquering Sword of Conan. And by this point, he was starting to become a little bit more experimental in his writing of the Conan stories. This is a very eclectic mix of stories. They're all pretty different from each other. And there were reasons for that, which I'll talk a little bit about. But this is interesting because at this point, by the time he wrote the last story, Red Nails, he was done with Conan pretty much. And he was mostly done with writing weird fiction. He had become more and more interested, or was becoming more and more interested, in writing stories of the American West. And he actually had an idea, kind of an ambitious idea, to write an epic of the American West. He had already been writing westerns, and he had been quite successful in a series of humorous westerns, the Breckinridge Elkins series. He had done well with that, but he wanted to move on to something more serious and more ambitious, like I say, which he never had a chance to do, unfortunately, because at the same time, he was also becoming more and more depressed. And this depression, unfortunately, led to his death. Which is tragic, because who knows where he could have gone from here, because this volume certainly shows how he was developing as a writer. Tremendously talented writer. He was already the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. Who knows what else he could have become and what else he would have written. I have some ideas about that, but of course they're just ideas. We'll never really know. But this is certainly an interesting volume. Another reason that he was becoming less interested in writing the Conan stories is simply because Weird Tales had stopped paying him on time. In fact, for a while, they stopped paying him at all. This was in the midst of the Depression. It was hard times for everybody. But unfortunately, Weird Tales, which was supposed to pay you upon publication, was not doing that. And so Robert E. Howard was writing these Conan stories and some other weird stories, sending them to Weird Tales. They would publish the stories in the magazine and wouldn't pay right away. And so he was left waiting for the money that was owed him. And this was a really bad time for that because his mother was very sick. And even though he was making more money than anyone else in Cross Plains pretty much at the time, it doesn't matter much when your mother's medical bills are piling up and you're not being paid for your work. So that certainly soured the writing of weird fiction for Robert E. Howard. I mean, his major outlet for those types of stories, that was Weird Tales. And he had a great affection for the magazine. But eventually he was thinking, hey, I've got to get paid for my work. And if these guys can't pay me on time, maybe I should think about doing something else. And so there were a few different things pushing him away from this character. One interesting thing is that since he was becoming more and more interested in writing stories of the American West, you actually see that interest show up in this volume, particularly in one of the greatest Conan stories ever, probably the greatest Conan stories ever written, which is in this book. This book opens with the story, The Servants of Bit Yakin, the Servants of Bit Yakin. And this volume is illustrated as all of the volumes are. And the illustrator of this is Gregory Manchess, who's really, really good. I'm not sure I like his illustrations quite as much as I like the illustrations in the first two volumes, but it's certainly different, and it does have kind of a classic style to it, which I enjoy. And I like that the art in all of the volumes are a little bit, it's all a little bit different. So that was cool. And the Servants of Bit Yakin, which is basically a story of Conan trying to get treasure and having to go to a lost city to get it and fight monsters and rescue a damsel in distress. I mean, a lot of the elements we were familiar with are in this story. It's also known as the Jewels of Gwalior. That was the name, I believe it was originally published under for Weird Tales, if I'm remembering right. I like that story. I think it's a pretty entertaining story. It's kind of in the middle as far as quality is concerned in Conan stories. Maybe a bit lower than that. But I enjoyed it quite a bit. I thought it was a lot of fun. I'm always up. Even an average Conan story is pretty darn good. And so that's what I thought of that. But that is followed up with almost certainly the greatest Conan story ever written, which is Beyond the Black River. It's not my favorite Conan story. My favorite Conan story is still The Hour of the Dragon. But I have to say, this is probably better as a story. And this story is the story where you start to see Howard's interest in the American West. We have Conan, who's an older man at this point, a few years, I think, before he became king of Aquilonia. And at this point, he is a scout for Aquilonia along the Black River, which is the border of Aquilonia, the western border. And west of the Black River is where a bunch of Picts live. Now, the Picts you see pop up in many of Robert E. Howard's stories. And in this story, they kind of take the place of Native Americans, basically. They're Picts, but in the they're kind of like the Hyborian age equivalent of Native Americans in this story. And we have a frontier fort, made of wooden logs and everything, and we have a bunch of Aquilonians who are frontiersmen, and they're in, buckskin and everything. They've got swords and crossbows and bows and arrows and things like that. Because this is still the Aquilonian age, but this is very much a Western story with, dark and horrifying sorcery, of course, which Conan runs across in this story. And the main character in this story is Conan, but the point of view character is actually a guy named Balthus, who is an Aquilonian frontiersman, a young man who's new to this area. He's new to the Black River. And he meets up with Conan, where they encounter a supernatural menace. And I don't want to spoil the story too much because it is, it's a short story. But it's interesting because in this story, you see Conan from Balthus's point of view. And so you see Conan from the outside. And if anything, he seems even more capable and superhuman in this story than he does in the stories which center more on him as a point of view character. And also in this story, Conan shows just how smart he is. I mean, he knows what's going on in Aquilonia. He knows the political situation. He could pretty much tell what's going to happen with the situation on the frontier, which is a very dangerous and volatile situation. The king of Aquilonia is not paying attention to what's going on, and the danger from the Picts is disregarded. And so we have a very explosive situation between the Picts and the Aquilonian frontiersmen. And it's a great, great story with, like I said, a great, horrifying supernatural menace, wonderful villain, and just a really interesting view of Conan. It's also very dark and pessimistic. It's just great. I have to say, it is a great story. And it's certainly the high point of this volume for me, I think. And it's a high point in the Conan series. It's probably the last really great story, I think, in the Conan saga. There are a couple really, really good ones after this. Right after Beyond the Black River, though, is an interesting story, a story called The Black Stranger. The Black Stranger, which is a pirate story where we have a nobleman who has run away from his city because he's run afoul of a supernatural menace himself, and so he's trying to hide from this menace by building this lonely fort and his home on this beach, which just happens to be really close to a bunch of dangerous Picts and a pirate treasure. And all of these things lead to trouble for this guy and the people with him, including a young woman and a young girl, which you don't see many children in Conan stories. So that was interesting. Another interesting thing about The Black Stranger is that Conan is not in it for a big chunk of the story. He's in the very beginning, and then he disappears from the story for a long time, and a bunch of other characters show up. Two pirate ships show up, and all of the characters in this, all the male characters anyway, are all scoundrels, you know. It sort of feels like if Quentin Tarantino had done a Pirate Conan movie, there would be nothing too surprising in here. This is what you would expect from that. And then Conan shows up, and he is also a scoundrel, of course. He's Conan, but, you know, he at least has a moral code. And it's a really interesting story. It's very dialogue heavy for a big chunk of it, which is why I don't like it as much as a lot of Conan fans do. I think it's a good story. I don't think it's a great story, though. I think it's a little heavy on dialogue and exposition. In fact, really heavy on it. I don't think there's enough Conan in this Conan story. Although when he shows up, he dominates the story, as Conan does. And it's a really good story. And it does have some of Robert E. Howard's best writing in it. So it's worth reading just for that. But as a story, as a Conan story, it's not my favorite. I think there are things about it that don't really work for me. And it didn't work for Farnsworth Wright either, the editor of Weird Tales. This was one of the few Conan stories that he just rejected. He didn't take it. I think it was a little too experimental for him. And so this is one of the Conan stories that is not in the public domain at this time, because it wasn't published until years and years later. L. Sprague de Camp took this story when he did his series of Conan's paperbacks, hardcovers and paperbacks. He took this story and just edited the hell out of it, changed all kinds of stuff needlessly, and just basically tore this story apart and Frankensteined it back together with a bunch of his own writing. It was a horror show what he did to The Black Stranger. I mean, it's not my favorite Conan story, but it was certainly good enough to have been published as is, you know. The changes were ridiculous. But, you know, that was L. Sprague de Camp for you. And so if you're getting like a cheapy Conan collection for your Kindle or something, which you can get because most of the stories are in the public domain, you won't get The Black Stranger. And it is well worth reading. I mean, it's a really interesting story. It was Robert E. Howard really experimenting. A little too much, unfortunately, because, like I said, this story was rejected. He did end up rewriting this Conan story as a non-Conan pirate story, which also I don't think sold, if I'm remembering right. I will have to double check that. So, The Black Stranger is a really, really interesting story, but not particularly successful for him. He followed that up with a very typical Conan story, The Maneaters of Zambala. Oh, it's the mailman. It's the mailman. Let's all bark at the mailman. Okay. The Maneaters of Zambala. There they are over there. No, they're cannibals in this story. This story is not great. It is not the worst Conan story, but it's down there. The plot is not particularly great. It's just okay. I mean, an okay Conan story is, pretty good. But it's certainly not one of his best. Plot-wise, it wasn't great. And there's some of that weird period racism in it, which seems kind of needless. Even at the time, I would think it would be, but it is what it is. And as a story, it's just not great. It's not terrible. It's just okay. But it was certainly a by-the-numbers Conan story, which is, I guess, what Robert E. Howard felt like he had to do after getting his last Conan story rejected. And it had its moments. It certainly had its moments. But then he followed that up with a really, really good Conan story, and that is Red Nails. Red Nails is excellent. One of the longest Conan stories. It has Valeria in it. Valeria, who was transformed into a different Valeria for the Conan film. But in this story, Red Nails, Valeria is Valeria of the Red Brotherhood. She is a pirate and a warrior. Very strong character who has to run away with the group she was fighting with because, she killed some guy and he totally had it coming. But, she killed this guy and had to take off. Conan follows her because Conan, he liked Valeria. They meet up, kill a dinosaur, and find a lost city, which is basically one enclosed building the size of a city. And inside this huge castle, basically, they find some people. The remnants of a civilization that has dwindled down to almost nothing. And we have two groups who are fighting each other. They both live at opposite ends of the city. And they're just trying to kill each other. And their whole reason for being is to slaughter the other side. It was basically a feud, and Robert E. Howard got his inspiration for this for some of the Western feuds that took place in the Old West and in Texas. He always found those very interesting, and he put that into this fantasy story. It's a very violent story, full of stuff that I think he knew Farnsworth Wright would like. And it works really, really well. And I think it's a worthy finish for Conan. Again, it's one of those Conan stories which I think is really good, but I don't think it's as good as everybody makes it out to be. I think there are some things about the story which are not particularly great. One of the things is that I think it's a little too long, actually. I think it's a bit longer than it needs to be for the story that it's trying to tell. But it's really good. It's excellent, I have to say. And that was it. That was the last that Robert E. Howard ever wrote of Conan, and I think he knew it. He knew it while he was writing Red Nails, I think, that this was going to be the last Conan story. Whether it would have been the last Conan story if he had lived, I doubt. I think if he could have pulled himself out of his depression, if things had been just a little different for him, I think eventually he would have written more Conan. I think these stories would have been rediscovered just as they were. And Conan would have, as a character, would have become popular. And I think had Robert E. Howard lived, yeah, he would have written more Conan stories. Because he was a working writer, and if something sold, he would write it, you know. And I think he really loved to write weird fiction, and I think he really enjoyed writing this series. But he was also interested in writing other things, and like I said, if the magazine you're writing for just stops paying you on time, you have to make some tough decisions. And so we are left with 3 volumes of Conan. Of the 3 volumes, even though this has the greatest Conan story in it, and it has some of the greatest writing by Robert E. Howard in this volume, this is probably my least favorite as a volume. I think I liked the first 2 volumes better. Which is not to say that this is bad at all. There's some stuff in here that's not great, but there's stuff in here that's terrific. And Beyond the Black River is one of the best things that Robert E. Howard ever wrote. Conan's story or not. It was just a brilliant piece of work. And it really makes you wish that you could see the Western stuff that he was planning on writing. If only he had lived to write it. That would have been something, I think. And who knows, he could have become a very popular Western writer. There was certainly a lot of really popular Western writers. I mean, he could have made a living just from writing Western paperbacks, you know. Unfortunately, we lost him. And so we never saw those stories. And Conan never returned. And since the Conan stories only fill 3 volumes of this size, many, many other writers have written Conan stories. None of them stack up to the work of Robert E. Howard. None come close. I think Conan was too deeply personal a character. He was too deeply personal a creation for anyone else to really do him justice. That is my opinion. I had a great time reading Conan last month, though, revisiting Conan once again. Robert E. Howard was so tremendously talented. If you didn't have a chance in Sumerian and September to read the Conan stories, I certainly highly recommend them. They're all worth reading. And like I said, the 3-volume set from Del Rey is fantastic if you can get it. Okay, I'll shut up now. I will catch you next time.